across town and pulled up at the Ketterman home in a blistering rain. She hated driving in the weather, but there were a few hours of gray light left on this stormy November Saturday. Babysitting. It wasn't a glamour gig, but the Kettermans seemed like nice people on the phone. And she had to admit the money was pretty good, $100 to watch a 10-year-old until midnight, while Tom and Lindsay Ketterman attended some kind of a fundraiser across town. $100 to sit on the couch, make a few snacks, and watch little Billy play video games while she talked to her boyfriend on the phone? Beats fast food and minimum wage for sure. She parked on the left edge of the driveway, threw the umbrella over her head, and scampered up onto the porch to ring the doorbell. Christy, thank you so much for doing this. Please come in and dry off. Lindsay Ketterman was a bright-eyed, animated woman in her mid-30s, dressed so properly that she seemed to have been time-warped in from a 1950s television show. Tom was walking down the staircase in a suit and tie, slightly older, hair parted on the side and slicked back like a TV preacher. He smiled and let Lindsay do all the talking. Billy's a good kid. He won't be any trouble. There's leftover chicken in the fridge if he gets hungry, and there's ice cream in the freezer, but don't let him go crazy, okay? Christy nodded, taking mental notes. The house is all yours. Make yourself at home. You've got my number saved in your phone, right? Saved right here, Christy replied. We're going to be late, but we'll be back as soon as this thing is over. Should be around midnight. Call or text me if you need anything, okay? Lindsay's face was a constant, reassuring smile, like a warm hug. But there was something else, something behind those eyes. Christy couldn't tell what it was. The Kettermans gathered the rest of themselves and stepped through the door leading into the garage. Just one car sharing two spaces. An odd choice for these two, Christy thought. It was an old, worn-out, gunmetal gray station wagon that probably came off the line back in the early 1970s. Tiny white wall tires and little outlines of rust around the edges, announcing that the car and its indoor parking spot had only recently been introduced. The garage door opened. The couple got into the station wagon. The key turned in the ignition, and Christy started to close the door to the house when Lindsay Ketterman shouted something from the passenger side window. She shouted, "Oh, and don't forget to rock the baby." And with that last syllable, and before Christy could really process the sentence, the car door closed, the vehicle was well out of the garage and on its way. Don't forget to rock the baby. What baby? There was only Billy. 10-year-old Billy, right? Christy grabbed her phone and started to text Lindsay Ketterman's number, asking about this baby. But at that moment, she was interrupted. Billy had walked into the kitchen, stuck his head halfway in the fridge, and Christy was hungry enough to join right in. Their growling tummies a prime opportunity for an introduction and some small talk. She placed her cell phone on the countertop. When she turned around to say something to Billy, he was already back in the living room in front of the TV. He wasn't a talkative kid. It wasn't necessarily a bad thing. But she queried him from the other room. "Hey, Billy, you don't have any brothers or sisters, right? It's just you, right?" Billy's head turned counterclockwise on his little shoulders in an almost alarming creep, his eyes not blinking. Christy looked around the kitchen, curious that the two windows in this room looked like they'd been forced closed, jammed into place, unable to open. "Billy, it's just you, right?" "Yes, it's just me." "Okay," Christy sighed. "Just making sure. I thought I heard your mom say something. It was weird." And Billy interrupted. "But don't forget to rock the baby." And then Billy's head turned back to face the television. as Christy felt the prickly cold pins of disoriented anxiety nip at the back of her neck. And then suddenly from upstairs, Christy just about jumped through the ceiling. And she stood there, at the end of the kitchen bar, the silhouette of Billy's head still black against the brightness of the TV, the muffled cry from upstairs piercing through her. "Billy!" She turned and looked up at the ceiling, looked down at her cell phone on the countertop again, back to the ceiling, and then yelled out, "Billy, you hear that?" "What is that? I thought you didn't have any brothers or sisters." "Billy?" But Billy wasn't there. The only thing moving beyond the images on the television was Christy herself, as she discovered herself already at the bottom of the staircase, looking up, listening, compelled to find a crying child somewhere above. Her steps upward were slow but deliberate, her senses on high alert, the hallway and doors slowly revealing themselves as Christy met the second floor. Still moving forward, 2 open doors on the right, none on the left, a closed third door at the end of the hallway. She crept forward still, her eyes keenly perceiving every window along her path, every window somehow sealed shut, with screws or nails or tiny boards that covered the latches. She peered through the first open doorway. An office with a desk and a chair, scattered papers, boxes, and machines. Forward further, 5 steps, she peered in through the second doorway. The room was empty. Nothing but light and shadows. She continued down the hall, 6 steps. She leaned toward the closed door. She placed her hand upon the cold brass doorknob and was about to turn it when... The sound was behind her, not behind the closed door, behind her. Before she realized she had done it, she burst backward and into the empty second bedroom, the baby's cries filling her frantic ears. She opened the closet. Nothing. She checked the window, again sealed shut. She twirled to look at each of the 4 walls. Nothing but light and shadow. Light and shadow. And then she noticed it. The shadow on the north-facing wall. A kind of cut-off rectangle with tiny pickets. The shadow, the shape, it seemed to flutter slightly for a second. And then... Christy fell backward with surprise and shock and confusion and terror. She was pressed backward against the far wall, not leaving, not pursuing, but locked, her eyes frozen upon the picket shadows, her ears still hearing the infant cry that her mind refused to accept. She lost all concept of time. She was frightened, but she did not flee. Who knows how many minutes passed by before Christy finally drew herself up, got control of her breathing, and inched toward the corner of the room, right hand outstretched, like someone feeling their way through the dark. The sound of the baby filled the room, filled her skull, a simultaneously compelling and frighteningly familiar sound that betrayed no origin. She inched forward, her hands out, slightly passing back and forth in the air. Forward even further, until Christy reached the wall with the shadows, and as her second finger grazed the shadow pattern before her, the cut-off rectangle with the tiny pickets, the shadow moved. Left, then right, then left, then right. And the room suddenly became as silent as an empty church, except for the sound of old creaking mahogany wood, and some tiny springs beneath them. Left, right, left, right. Don't forget to rock the baby. She's not my sister. Christy screamed in surprise as she spun around to see little Billy in the doorway to the room, the boy's voice eerily calm and steady. She was here when I got here. She cries sometimes. Christy became self-consciously aware that she was still gesturing like a metronome with a shadow on the wall. And she abruptly stopped, realizing the absurdity, the insanity of what was happening. Now there was no baby crying, only the timpani of her own pounding heart. The cloudy, rain-filtered light of dusk filtering through the window, the boy in the doorway, the shadow of a child's cradle upon the wall, cast there from empty space inside an empty room. Christy felt like she was going to lose the power to stand, but she didn't want to fall, not here. A blur of scrambling seconds later, she was sprawled at the top of the staircase, resting back against the rail, one eye on the open second doorway, both ears constantly scanning for the phantom wailings of a newborn child. We have to rock her so she won't cry. If she cries, she'll wake up Mr. Janty. Mr. Janty, Christy replied. You don't want to wake up Mr. Janty. Billy stared at her. He was wiser than his years, but eerily matter-of-fact, as he spoke about things that should not be, that could not be, all around him. He kept his explanation simple, because that's how he understood it. Mr. Janty doesn't like people. Mr. Janty hurts people. Who is Mr. Janty? I stay in my room when he comes out, and I lock the door. Mr. Janty always checks the doorknobs. Who is Mr. Janty? He came here after. Christy realized that she was holding her breath. She asked that same question a third time. Billy, who is Mr. Janty? Christy did not need to be told to believe in ghosts. She'd long felt that the physical world could be touched by spirits. She'd heard ghost stories, and she believed many of them. And this was the story in which she somehow played the starring role. There were things here, both alive and dead, able to make rules and break them, and somehow both here and not here. She stepped a little further away from Billy. Who was this boy? Who were these people? Were they all phantoms? Was anything or anyone real? The hallway spun into a blur, and Christy felt herself stagger. And then, again, suddenly, and behind the sound of a baby's cry, come on, quick! Billy sounded excited for the first time. He grabbed Christy's hand and ran back into the room of light and shadows. He closed the door and locked it. The crying infant sounded like it was right next to her. But again, only the air, only the shadow of a baby's crib against the wall. He's awake. Billy continued to speak in a kind of monotone, but his eyes had changed. They were sharper, wider, like that of prey on high alert for a predator. His hands wrapped around the doorknob as he pushed the rest of himself toward the hinges. Rock the baby. The only connection between instruction and action that Christy could find was that rib cage of tiny railed posts unnaturally cast upon the wall. From her sitting position on the floor, knees pulled into her chest, hands trembling, Christy reached up and pushed inward against the dark outline. until it moved. Back, forth, back, forth, responding to her touch that wasn't a touch, quieting the infant voice, back, forth, back, forth. Billy looked over to Christy, placing his finger upon his lips, giving the universal sign for quiet. Quiet. Don't say anything. So quietly, Christy just continued manipulating the shadow. Back, forth, back, forth. Rock the baby. Rock the baby. They both stared at the tarnished old doorknob, locked from within. The only thing separating them from whatever it was that staggered and clamored within the house beyond. You didn't want to wake Mr. Janty. Mr. Janty always checks the doorknobs. And they could hear the heavy footsteps walking away. Karina died here. What? Karina, that's her name. She was here when I got here. Karina. Yeah. She cries sometimes. I don't know why. Maybe because she died. Maybe because she's all alone. Karina cries. Yeah, sometimes. And she wakes up Mr. Janty. Yeah, sometimes. Christy suddenly focused on her surroundings. This closed shell of a house. Billy, who is Mr. Janty? Christy held her right hand over her mouth to muffle the scream. She hadn't even realized it until she did, that her left hand was back against the shadow of the crib, pulsing it like a sprinter's heartbeat. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then purposefully slowing, willing herself down, slowing down, slow down, rock the baby, gently rocking, go to sleep, rock-a-bye baby, in the treetop, when the wind blows, the cradle will rock, when the bough breaks, the cradle will fall. Oh God, what a stupid song. Just rock the baby, rock the baby, rock the baby. The doorway was consumed with this thing, so tall that it was forced to lower its head to see below the door frame, so broad that it had to turn sideways to slide into the room. It was a mountain of angry flesh, the veins lining its limbs as if drawn there with a painter's brush. The hands were enormous, with unnaturally long fingers below the knuckles, pointing at the ground like spears. The pores of its skin seemed to gape and yaw like little mouths. The lower jaw hung low under the weight of massive teeth. The eyes seemed to pull backward into the face in a kind of sinister squint, the pupils glowing bright red and filled with violence. Christy and Billy became like statues. No movement, no sound. Except for Christy's index finger still gently rocking the ghostly child. Rocking. Mr. Janty. He was pure malevolence, no question. He was an unholy thing, no question. He was not of this world. He scanned the room with eyes like the blood moon, breathing, scanning, in, out, back, forth, close enough to touch. Mr. Janty looked right where Christy was sitting pressed against the wall. She had never in her life been so scared, not even close. She held her breath. She choked back her fear. And she held quiet as the baby became quiet, rocking, rocking, rocking the baby. Mr. Janty looked down, then around, and then straight ahead. He had looked right through them. As the breath was about to scream out of her lungs, Christy then watched this dark, deadly giant retreat back through the doorway, turn and walk down to the end of the hallway, to the room from which he first emerged. If Billy hadn't moved first, Christy might have been frozen in that spot until morning. But move he did, and he seemed to release the oxygen in the whole room when he gently closed the door upon its now bent latch and sat backward against it. Scary, huh? Billy, what is that thing? What's happening? I'm not supposed to be here. They make me stay here. What? What do you mean? Mr. and Mrs. Ketterman. You mean your mom and dad? Oh, they're not my mom and dad. They're not. Billy, where are your mom and dad? I don't know. They're at home, I guess. I don't really know where I am. You don't know how you got here? I know how I got here. It was a long time ago. I was at the shopping mall with Mom. She got busy talking to someone. And there was somebody behind me and they said something I can't remember. And I woke up and I was in the wrong car. And Mr. and Mrs. Ketterman were there and they said that Mom wanted me to come with them. And they said they were going to be my new family. I tried to get out of the car, but they were going so fast and I didn't know what to do. I yelled for Mom, but I couldn't see anything with that blanket on my face. That was a really long time ago. They kidnapped you. It was a long time ago. Did they say why they brought you here? Mrs. Ketterman said that she wanted a baby. Another baby. The first baby didn't live. They had a baby that didn't survive. She said it cried all the time. It cried all the time, and so she did something, and she made the crying stop. Jesus. I guess she wanted a baby that was older, you know, a baby that wouldn't cry all the time. And then they saw you. I don't know. This isn't even your family. I don't know. And they make you rock the baby. I think they made God angry, you know? When they made the baby go quiet the first time, they made God angry. So God sent Mr. Janty. And now they make you rock the baby. That's my job, they always say. They say, you rock the baby. Sometimes it's for all day. I don't get to go outside. And if you don't rock the baby, God will send Mr. Janty. If the baby cries, Mr. Janty doesn't like it when the baby cries. Billy, has Mr. Janty ever hurt you? I hid under the bed, but I saw what he did. You saw what? Oh, he broke Mr. Ketterman's leg real bad. And he threw Mrs. Ketterman up against the wall real bad. She was fast, though. She got in here and she rocked the baby. But you know, if she hadn't, I don't know. Mr. Janty, he was awful mad.
I don't know what he would have done. I just closed my eyes and I heard him go away.
Christy sat there quietly processing everything she just heard. She was confused, she was shocked, afraid, enraged. This boy sitting right in front of her just stared ahead matter-of-factly, like all hope had long ago been bled out of him. He was a prisoner in someone else's story, a shadow of the boy he used to be. Who knows how long he had been in this place? And the minutes ticked by as they sat there, until Christy finally said, "Billy, would you like to get out of here with me?" That's not gonna happen. Christy spun to see Mr. and Mrs. Ketterman standing in the bedroom doorway. For the first time, Mr. Ketterman spoke. "Don't fight us, Christy. You have a very special purpose for being here." His wife jumped in. "She has such beautiful eyes, lovely hair, beautiful skin. I always wanted a girl. She even looks a little bit like you." Mr. Ketterman's face was eerily serene. Everything is coming together. "Welcome home, honey. You can take care of Billy, and we will take care of you." Christy's eyes were wild with desperation. This had all been a ruse to get her inside. Mr. Ketterman lunged at her and put a cloth over her mouth. The cloth was wet and smelled of chemicals. Christy's heavy gasps drew the chemicals into her lungs, and she felt herself beginning to lose consciousness. She struggled and clawed, her shoes kicking off the soles of her feet with the effort, but she was no match for the man who held her against the wall. Her vision blurred, her limbs got weak, her screams became pitiful moans. Through her semi-conscious haze, she scanned the room, and her eyes locked on Billy. And on his face, she no longer saw the passive gaze, the resigned eyes, the muted expression of a little lost boy. On Billy's face, she saw rage. Billy screamed at a volume that rattled the glass of the windows. He grabbed one of Christy's shoes and he slammed it repeatedly against the wall, over and over with all of his might, pounding at the house like a drum, shouting two words at the top of his voice: "Wake up! Wake up! Wake up!" Mr. Ketterman released his hold on Christy. He and his wife lunged for the boy in a panic. But he was small and he was fast, and he slipped out of their grasps as he flailed about the room, still pounding on the walls and yelling, "Wake up! Wake up!" Christy suddenly realized what Billy was trying to do, and she joined in, on tempo, banging her fists against the shadow of the rocker on the wall. "Wake up! Wake up! Wake up!" And following that terrible cry came another. And in a flash, Mr. Janty was there. His hands were open, as was his mouth with the jagged teeth, the awful breath reeking of a week-old corpse. The eyes locked first on Mrs. Ketterman, and he was upon her. His gigantic right hand covered the whole of her face, muffling her screams. His mouth opened even wider, another roar tearing through the room. And Mr. Janty closed his hand into a fist to the sound of Mrs. Ketterman's breaking skull. Her arms and legs went limp, and then Mr. Janty dropped her now almost headless body down onto the floor like a bloody rag. He slowly turned his gaze to the left. Mr. Ketterman,
who could not escape through the blocked bedroom door, was cowering in the corner. He cried out in desperation, "I'll let her go. I'll let them both go. They're free. There's no reason to hurt me. They're free. They're both free to go away and never come back here ever. They're free." Mr. Janty's head cocked a little bit to one side. He didn't seem to really be considering the words, except with a kind of amusement at this man's desperate ploy. His expression was clear. No, you will not survive this day. You will not survive. Mr. Janty stepped toward Mr. Ketterman and grabbed him by the calf of the leg with a grip like that of a shark. And as the desperate man clawed at the walls and carpet, Mr. Janty began to drag him out of the room. The pounding of the man's limbs dented the door and tore at the sheetrock as he bargained again and again for his life. "Don't do this. What can I do? Tell me what to do. I'll make it right. I'll do what's right." The words might as well have been in another language. To Mr. Janty, they meant nothing. All of a sudden, Mr. Janty's beastly frame stopped in the hallway. He looked back into the room, then down at Mr. Ketterman, then back into the room. And suddenly Mr. Janty reached down with his massive hands, grabbed Mr. Ketterman's left leg just above the kneecap, and he snapped it to the bone. The sound of the scream was deafening. Mr. Ketterman writhed on the floor of the hallway as Mr. Janty then released him and stepped back into the bedroom. He stared at Christy and Billy, his eyes still brimming with murderous rage. His heavy breath like a kick in the chest every time he exhaled. He scanned them both, left and right, his enormous hands balled up into fists, the sound of the baby's cry piercing the room. An eternal minute passed. Then Mr. Janty moved his giant frame toward the back of the room, toward the picket shadows on the bedroom wall. And with his left hand, he touched the shape of the baby's crib, not clumsily, not angrily, but with a gentleness that you wouldn't think possible for a creature like this. And he rocked it back and forth and back and forth until the baby's cries went silent. And he held his hand there upon the picket frame, upon the shadow, as the room grew deathly silent, and the shadow upon the wall slowly disappeared, and only Mr. Janty, Christy, and Billy remained. The giant drifted its eyes once again toward the terrified teenager and her young charge. And then it turned even further to gaze at the agony taking place in the hallway, Mr. Ketterman trying so hard to drag himself away on a shattered leg. In a blink, Mr. Janty was upon him, and they listened to the man's screams as Mr. Janty's giant footsteps moved down the hall, down the stairs, beyond this world, into the everlasting storm. Not all avenging angels are covered in white light. Sometimes they're dark and violent, terrible to the eyes and ears and senses. But the nightmare was over. There was no baby cry. There were no cries of any kind. Only the sound of the rain upon the windows and the assurances from the older to the younger that the danger had passed, that the door was open, that there was a family out there waiting for him to come home, and that everything was going to be all right.